She ran from danger, only to fall into the arms of the man who owned the city. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The numbers were a language Elena Cruz understood better than people. They were clean, logical, and they never lied. Tonight, the numbers screamed a truth so ugly it had sent her scrambling from her small cubicle at Sterling and Finch Accounting. A thrifted trench coat thrown over her shoulders, and a leather messenger bag heavy with stolen ledgers banging against her hip. The truth was this. Her firm, the place where she'd spent 3 years meticulously balancing accounts and dreaming of a senior position, was a laundromat for the Morty crime family. And the men who'd noticed her late-night discovery were not middle managers concerned with corporate espionage. They were men with cold eyes and ill-fitting suits who moved with the predatory grace of wolves, men who had the city's police on a leash. Now they were hunting her through the slick, unforgiving streets of a city that had suddenly become a labyrinth of shadows and threats. Rain fell in sheets, blurring the neon signs into watercolor streaks and plastering stray strands of her chestnut hair to her cheeks. Her scuffed flats offered no purchase on the slick pavement, and a stitch of pure, unadulterated terror was tightening in her side. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The black sedan was still there, crawling along the curb 2 blocks back, its headlights cutting through the downpour like a predator's gaze. They were toying with her, letting her run, letting the fear build until it consumed her. Panic clawed at her throat, raw and suffocating. She darted left into a narrow alley that smelled of wet garbage and despair, hopping to lose them in the maze of the city's forgotten pathways. The walls closed in, brick and rusted metal pressing close. The only light came from a flickering bare bulb above a steel door, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with her ragged breaths. A dead end. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Trapped. The distant sound of car doors slamming shut echoed down the alley, followed by the heavy tread of footsteps approaching. This was it. Her life, her quiet, orderly existence, was about to be extinguished in a filthy alley over numbers on a page. Spinning around, desperate for an escape that wasn't there, she slammed into something solid. Not a wall of brick, but a wall of a man. The impact sent a jolt through her entire body, knocking the air from her lungs. A low grunt of surprise met her ears, and strong hands, encased in soft leather, clamped onto her upper arms to steady her. The messenger bag slipped from her shoulder, its contents spilling onto the wet concrete with a sickening thud and the slap of paper. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked up, her rain-drenched vision struggling to focus. The man was impossibly tall, a silhouette of power against the alley's dim light. He wore a custom charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the darkness around him, the fabric uncreased despite the rain, an open-collared white shirt revealing the hint of black ink tattoo lines at his throat. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, his jaw tight, a faint, pale scar tracing its line. But it was his eyes that stole her breath, an icy, piercing blue that seemed to see straight through her terror to the frantic, cornered animal beneath. On his right hand, a heavy black signet ring gleamed dully. This was not a savior. This was a different, more refined kind of danger. "Watch where you're going," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through her. It was not a question or a suggestion, it was a command. The footsteps grew closer, more confident. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, her hands instinctively clutching the lapels of his suit. "Please, you have to help me. They're going to kill me." His gaze flickered from her face down to the mess at their feet. Among the scattered pens and her cracked phone lay a thick, leather-bound ledger, flipped open to a page of damning figures. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of something she couldn't name, recognition, calculation, passing through them as he read the name neatly inscribed at the top of the column, Morty Logistics. He looked back at her then, his expression unreadable, and the world seemed to slow down. The approaching footsteps were a drumbeat counting down her final seconds. He seemed to be weighing her, judging her worth, the cost of her plea. He was Dominic Vale. She didn't know his name, not yet, but she knew his kind. He was the sort of man who owned skylines and politicians, whose power was an invisible, unassailable force in the city. The man who owned the very air they were breathing. He made his decision in an instant. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he bent down, his expensive suit miraculously avoiding the grime, and picked up the ledger. He tucked it under his arm as if it were a newspaper before his gaze swept back to her, pinning her in place. "Who's going to kill you?" he asked, his voice calm, yet carrying an edge that could strip flesh from bone. I was mugged," she stammered, the lie tasting like ash on her tongue. It was a pathetic, flimsy shield against the tidal wave of violence about to crash over her. Her mind screamed at her own foolishness. This man was no fool. He didn't even grant her the dignity of pretending to believe it. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "A mugging," he repeated, the words dripping with disbelief. Just then, two large men rounded the corner, their faces hard, their hands reaching inside their jackets. They stopped short when they saw Dominic Vale. The confidence drained from their faces, replaced by a mixture of shock and a sudden, primal fear. They recognized him. Of course, they recognized him. He was a landmark in this city, more permanent and more dangerous than any building. Dominic didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply straightened to his full, imposing height, one hand still resting lightly on Alina's arm, a clear and unmistakable claim. "These your muggers?" he asked, his icy blue eyes fixed on the two men. The larger of the two thugs swallowed hard. "Mr. Vale, we have no business with you, just the girl." "She's with me now," Dominic stated, the finality in his tone turning the air to ice. "Which means your business with her is concluded. I suggest you return to Antonio Morty and tell him that anything he lost tonight now belongs to me. If he has a problem with that, he knows where to find me." The name Morty, spoken from his lips, was a curse and a promise. The two men exchanged a nervous glance, their bravado completely gone. They were attack dogs, but they had just run up against the apex predator of their world, and they knew it. Without another word, they turned and retreated, their footsteps hurried, their retreat far less intimidating than their approach. The alley was silent again, save for the steady drumming of the rain and the frantic beating of Alina's own heart. She was trembling, a combination of cold, fear, and a strange, dizzying relief. She was alive. This man, this stranger, had saved her with nothing more than his name and his presence. He finally released her arm, and the absence of his touch left her feeling strangely untethered. He gestured with his chin toward the mouth of the alley, where a sleek black sedan, so dark it seemed to be cut from the night itself, now idled silently at the curb. A driver stood holding an umbrella. "You're coming with me," he said. It wasn't a question. Alina hesitated, gathering the rest of her spilled belongings with shaking hands. Her mind was racing. She had run from danger only to fall directly into the arms of something far more powerful and infinitely more complex. Going with him felt like trading one cage for another, perhaps a more gilded one, but a cage all the same. Yet what choice did she have? The Mortys knew who she was. They knew where she lived. They would not stop. Her old life was over, incinerated in the moment she decided to take those ledgers. Looking back at Dominic Vale, who stood waiting with an unnerving patience, the ledger still tucked securely under his arm, she knew she had no other path. He was not a savior. He was a shark who had smelled blood in the water, and she was the source. But for now, his protection was the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave. With a deep, shuddering breath that did little to calm her frayed nerves, she walked toward the black car, leaving the last remnants of her simple life behind on the wet, unforgiving pavement of the alley. The deal had been struck without her consent, sealed by a lie he never believed and a truth he had instantly recognized as his own. The ride to Vale Tower was silent and suffocating. Alina sat stiffly on the buttery leather seat, the city's blurred lights painting fleeting patterns across Dominic's impassive face. He didn't look at her, his attention fixed on the ledger resting on his lap, his gloved fingers tracing the columns of figures she knew by heart. The car moved with a silent, predatory grace, parting traffic, as if by sheer force of will, a bubble of insulated calm amidst the storm. When they pulled into the private underground entrance of his building, the world outside simply ceased to exist. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and glass, an exercise in cold, brutalist opulence. Armed guards in discreetly tailored suits stood at attention, their eyes missing nothing, their presence a quiet testament to the fortress she had just entered. She followed him into a private elevator that ascended with dizzying speed, the only sound the soft hum of the machinery. Her ears popped as they reached the top floor, and the doors slid open to reveal not a hallway, but the entrance to his private residence. The penthouse was less a home and more a kingdom in the sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the storm-lashed city below, the harbor lights twinkling like a fallen constellation. The space was vast, furnished with minimalist pieces of dark wood and chrome that seemed to emphasize the emptiness rather than fill it. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly intimidating. It was a cage, and the view was only there to remind the occupant of how far they were from the world. A man with graying temples and a perfectly tailored suit, older than Dominic but with the same air of quiet competence, met them at the door. "Marco," Dominic said, his voice flat. "Our guest will be staying in the East Wing suite. Have some clothes sent up for her, something comfortable, and food." He glanced at Alina, his gaze clinical, as if assessing a new acquisition. "She looks like she hasn't eaten in a day." Marco's eyes, a placid brown, rested on her for a moment, taking in her drenched clothes, her tangled hair, and the terror she was failing to conceal. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course, Dominic." He then addressed her, his tone polite but distant. "Miss, if you'll follow me." Alina hesitated, her eyes darting back to Dominic, who was already shrugging off his wetsuit jacket and tossing it onto a leather chair. He was unbuttoning his cuffs, revealing more of the intricate black tattoos that snaked up his forearms. He held the ledger, her ledger, in one hand. It was the chain that now bound her to him. "Where are you going with that?" she asked, her voice stronger than she expected. He paused, his icy blue eyes meeting hers across the cavernous room. "We have work to do," he said simply. "But first, you will get warm, you will eat, and you will stop looking like a drowned rat. I can't think when you're dripping on my floor." The dismissal was blunt, absolute. He turned and walked toward a massive black desk that overlooked the city, leaving her standing there, feeling small and powerless. The suite Marco led her to was larger than her entire apartment. A king-sized bed with crisp white linens, a bathroom clad in gray marble with a rainfall shower, and a walk-in closet already stocked with an impersonal collection of designer basics: silk pajamas, cashmere sweaters, tailored trousers. It was a luxurious prison cell. Half an hour later, after a scalding shower that did little to wash away the chill of her fear, she emerged wrapped in a thick robe to find a tray of food on a small table: hot soup, fresh bread, and a glass of water. A simple, elegant selection of clothes was laid out on the bed. She ate mechanically, the food tasteless in her mouth, her thoughts consumed by the man in the other room and the ledger that held her fate. She dressed in the soft gray sweater and black trousers he had provided, the expensive fabric a stark contrast to her own worn, practical wardrobe. The clothes were another form of control, another way of erasing who she was and remaking her into someone who belonged in his world. When she finally gathered the courage to return to the main living area, she found him exactly where she had left him, seated at his desk, the ledger open before him under the glow of a single lamp. He had a glass of amber liquid beside him and had rolled up his sleeves, revealing the full extent of his tattoos, a dense, abstract tapestry of black ink that spoke of a life far removed from corporate boardrooms. He didn't look up as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the seat. For a long while, the only sounds were the distant howl of the wind against the glass and the soft rustle of paper as he turned a page. The tension in the room was a living thing, coiling in the space between them. "The shell corporations," he finally said, his voice low and focused. "You traced them through 3 different offshore accounts. The Cayman Islands, then Cyprus, then back through a holding company in Delaware. Clever. Most accountants wouldn't have the patience, or the nerve, to dig that deep. The shipping manifests didn't match the invoices," she explained, her voice quiet but steady. She was on familiar ground here with the numbers. The declared cargo weight was consistently 10% less than the paid freight charges. The difference was being funneled into these accounts. It was sloppy, but they were arrogant. They assumed no one would ever look. He looked up at her then, and the intensity of his gaze made her stomach clench. It wasn't praise in his eyes, but a sharp, analytical assessment. He was seeing her now, not just as a terrified woman, but as a tool, a sharp and useful one. "Antonio Morty has always been arrogant," he murmured, a dangerous edge to his voice. It's a family trait. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. You've handed me the key to dismantling his entire financial network. But this is only half of the picture. These are the roots. I need the names. Who at the Port Authority is signing off on these manifests? Who at the city controller's office is ignoring the red flags? Who are the cops protecting his shipments? Elena shook her head, the faint scar along her brow puckering. I don't know. That information wasn't in the books. I'm just an accountant. You were an accountant, he corrected her, his voice silky smooth but laced with steel. Now you work for me, and we are going to find those names together. The "we" hung in the air, a declaration of a partnership she had never agreed to. Over the next several hours they worked. He was relentless, pushing her, questioning her, his mind as sharp and analytical as her own. An unnerving synergy developed between them, a shared language of figures and strategy. She saw the ruthlessness of his intellect, the way he could connect disparate pieces of information to form a coherent, lethal plan. And in the moments he would pause, his gaze lingering on her face as she explained a complex transaction, she felt a different kind of danger. A magnetic pull that had nothing to do with the Mortys and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. He was possessive, domineering, and utterly terrifying, but there was a part of her, a part she hated, that responded to the raw, undiluted power he exuded. For the first time since she had fled her office, she felt a sliver of something other than fear. It was a strange, intoxicating feeling of safety, found in the heart of the storm itself. The temptation was not just to accept his protection, but to understand the man who offered it, to see behind the icy blue eyes and discover the secrets he guarded as closely as his empire. The days that followed settled into a strange and tense routine. Elena lived in the sky, a ghost in Dominic's opulent world, her existence confined to the glass penthouse and the company of the man who was both her protector and her captor. They spent their hours hunched over the ledgers and a network of computers Dominic's team had set up, cross-referencing shipping logs, bank transfers, and encrypted communications. In him, she found a shockingly brilliant partner, a man whose mind moved with a predatory speed that both thrilled and frightened her. He, in turn, seemed to find a grudging respect for her meticulous mind. The unspoken tension between them was a constant, a low hum of awareness that charged the air whenever he leaned too close, his scent of expensive cologne and clean soap filling her senses, or when his fingers brushed against hers as they pointed to a discrepancy on the screen. She was acutely aware of the hard muscle of his arm, the cold weight of the signet ring, the piercing quality of his gaze when he caught her watching him. She learned the rhythms of his life, the early mornings spent in a private gym, the silent, intense phone calls in Russian or Italian, the way he prowled the length of the penthouse at night, a glass of whiskey in hand, the city spread at his feet like a conquered territory. Her old life felt like a distant dream, a story that had happened to someone else. The only tether she had to it was her younger brother, Leo. She had called him from a burner phone Dominic had provided, feeding him a practiced lie about a sudden consulting job that was taking her out of town. He had been skeptical, his voice laced with the familiar blend of worry and resentment he always directed at her. Leo was her weak spot, the one raw, aching vulnerability she carried. Since their parents' death in a car accident years ago, she had been his sole guardian, a role she had often failed at. He was charming and reckless, always chasing a shortcut, and his gambling debts were a constant shadow hanging over them. She had just managed to pay off his latest bookie, a fact that now filled her with a cold dread. Her fear was realized on the fourth day. Dominic was on a conference call in his office, his voice a low, menacing murmur behind a closed door when Marco entered the living area, his face grim. "Miss Cruz," he said, his tone formal but laced with an unusual urgency. "There's a call for you." A cold fist closed around her heart. "For me, who knows I'm here." "They don't," Marco said grimly. "They called Mr. Vale's private line. They asked for the accountant." He held out a sleek, encrypted phone. Elena took it with a trembling hand. The voice on the other end was gravelly and smug, a voice she recognized from the alley. It was one of Morty's men. "We've been looking all over for you, sweetheart," the voice oozed. "Turns out you're harder to find than we thought, But your little brother, Leo, he's not so careful. He owes some friends of ours a lot of money. It would be a shame if he had an accident trying to pay it back." The threat was clear, a knife twisting in her gut. They had him. They were going to hurt him because of her. "What do you want?" she whispered, her throat tight. "Just the books, sweetheart, and a conversation. We'll trade you, your brother, for the ledgers. You have 1 hour." He gave her an address, a derelict warehouse down by the docks, and the line went dead. She sank into a chair, the phone slipping from her grasp. A choked sob escaped her lips. Just then, Dominic's office door opened. He took one look at her ashen face and Marco's stony expression and knew. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence a sudden storm of controlled fury. "What happened?" he demanded, his eyes boring into her. Through her tears, she told him. She told him about Leo, about his debts, about the warehouse. She expected him to be angry, to see her brother as a liability she had failed to mention. Instead, his expression hardened into something far more dangerous than anger. It was a cold, chilling calm. He took the phone from Marco, his jaw tight, the scar there a stark white line against his olive skin. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice a low growl. "It is the last mistake Antonio Morty will ever make." He turned to Marco. "Get the car, and tell Nico to meet us there. No sirens, no police. This is a family matter." He then looked at Alina, his icy eyes softening for a fraction of a second. He crouched in front of her, taking her trembling hands in his. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "I will get him back," he said, not as a promise, but as a statement of indisputable fact. "They will not harm him. Do you understand me, Alina?" She could only nod, her throat too thick with fear to speak. Later that night, long after Marco had returned with a pale and shaken, but completely unharmed, Leo, the penthouse was quiet again. Her brother was sedated and sleeping in the guest suite, oblivious to the violence that had been enacted on his behalf. Dominic had refused to give her details, but she had seen the blood on the knuckles of his right hand when he returned, a dark stain he had quickly washed away. Now he found her on the shuttered rooftop garden, a hidden sanctuary of dormant plants and rain-slicked stone benches she had discovered earlier. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cold. The city lights glittered below them, impossibly distant. She was wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the view when he came to stand beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "Thank you," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "Whatever you did, thank you." He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "The Mortys don't understand loyalty," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't place. "They see it as a weakness to be exploited. My father, he made that mistake. He thought a truce was the same as an alliance." He turned to her then, the city lights catching the sharp planes of his face. He reached up and touched the faint scar on his jaw. "I was 17 when they killed him." It was supposed to be a meeting to formalize his move away from the old ways, to make our family's businesses completely legitimate. The Mortys agreed, then they ambushed us. They thought they had killed me, too. "This," he said, his thumb tracing the pale line, "was a gift from Antonio's father to remind me of the price of trust." The confession hung in the cold night air, a raw, exposed nerve. Suddenly, he was not just Dominic Vale, the untouchable king of the city. He was a boy who had watched his father die, a man forged in betrayal and a thirst for a vengeance that had simmered for nearly 2 decades. His wound was not just the scar on his face, but a deep, unhealed trauma that drove his every action. In his story, she saw an echo of her own loss, the same sudden, violent severing of her world when her parents died. An invisible thread of shared grief and loss now connected them, pulling them closer in the silent darkness. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently touched his jaw, tracing the scar that he had just laid bare for her. His skin was warm beneath her cold fingers. He didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch ever so slightly, a silent surrender that was more intimate than any kiss. In that moment, on a rooftop high above the world, the protector revealed his own wound, and the woman he was protecting began to see the man beneath the armor. The shared vulnerability on the rooftop garden irrevocably altered the space between them. The fragile wall of professionalism and fear that Alina had painstakingly maintained crumbled into dust. The tension that had once been a source of anxiety now crackled with a different kind of energy, a potent and undeniable attraction. Their work on the ledgers continued, but it was now punctuated by long moments of silence where their eyes would meet across the desk, holding a conversation that had no need for words. He started to bring her coffee in the morning, leaving a steaming mug on the table beside her work, a simple gesture that felt monumental in its thoughtfulness. She, in turn, found herself watching him, noticing the subtle shifts in his mood, the way a muscle in his jaw would tick when he was deep in thought, the rare, fleeting smile that would touch his lips when she found a crucial piece of the puzzle. Their shared mission had become something more. It was a partnership forged in secrets and a mutual desire for justice, or perhaps for vengeance. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of tracing a network of corrupt port officials, Dominic pushed his chair back from the desk. "Enough," he said, his voice tired. "We're going out." Elena's head snapped up. Out where, I caw." "You can," he interrupted, his gaze firm. "You are with me. No one will touch you." He had Marco bring in a garment bag. Inside was a dress the color of a midnight sky, a simple, elegant sheath of dark blue silk that felt impossibly soft against her skin. It fit as if it had been made for her. When she emerged from her room, her hair styled and her face touched with the subtle makeup she'd found in the bathroom, Dominic was waiting for her. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his customary white shirt open at the collar. He looked at her, and for the first time, the cool assessment in his eyes was replaced by something warmer, something that felt dangerously like admiration. He said nothing, but his gaze was more potent than any compliment. He took her to a private, wood-paneled club, the kind of place with no sign on the door, where the city's true power brokers convened in hushed tones over expensive liquor. As they walked in, a silence fell over the room. Every eye was on them, on her. She felt the weight of their stares, the curiosity and the speculation. She was on Dominic Vale's arm, and in this world, that was a declaration. It was a statement of ownership. The price of his protection was her anonymity, her independence. She was no longer Elena Cruz, junior accountant. She was his. The realization was both terrifying and intoxicating. He guided her to a secluded booth, his hand a warm, possessive weight on the small of her back. He ordered them drinks, and for the first time he spoke to her not as a colleague or a ward, but as a man speaking to a woman he desired. He asked her about her life before all this, about the scar on her brow from a childhood bike fall, about her dreams. He listened with an unnerving intensity, his eyes never leaving hers. "Are you doing this to prove a point?" she asked quietly, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. "To show everyone that the woman who holds the key to the Morty's downfall belongs to you." He leaned forward, the faint scent of his cologne and the whiskey on his breath enveloping her. "I am doing this," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble, "because I want to be here with you, not with the accountant or the key, but with Elena." He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. "I have spent half my life building an empire out of revenge. It is a cold and empty kingdom. You are the first thing in a very long time that has felt like anything other than a means to an end." His confession was raw, stripped of his usual armor. He promised her a future, one where her brother would be safe, where she would have a life of her own, a partnership with him, not a subservience to him. It was a promise that a part of her, the part that had been so alone for so long, desperately wanted to believe. Later that night, back in the silent penthouse, the city a glittering tapestry below them, the electricity that had been building for days finally arced between them. He walked her to the door of her suite, his hand still holding hers. He stopped, turning to face her, his tall frame blocking out the rest of the world. He lifted his free hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, then the faint scar at her brow. His touch was feather-light, reverent. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of dominance or possession, but one of startling tenderness, of a deep, aching need that mirrored her own. She melted against him, her hands coming up to clutch his suit jacket, anchoring herself to him as the world tilted on its axis. The romance was no longer a fragile, unspoken thing. It was real, terrifying, and all-consuming. But as their connection deepened, so did the danger. The Mortys were growing desperate. Their failed attempt to use Leo as leverage had backed them into a corner. Now, their surveillance on Dominic's operations became more aggressive. A car followed them from the club. Marco's men intercepted chatter about a planned hit, not on Dominic, but on the woman with him. She had become his weakness, the one vulnerability in his impenetrable fortress. The price of his promise of a future was that she might not live to see it. One afternoon, as they were preparing to leave for a meeting with a district attorney Dominic owned, Marco burst in, his face pale. "They know about the DA," he said, his voice tight. "There's a team waiting for you in the garage. It's an ambush." The enemies were no longer closing in. They were at the gates. Dominic's promise of protection was about to be put to the ultimate test, and Alina had to decide if the man she was falling in love with was worth dying for. The air in the penthouse crackled with a sudden, violent energy. The news of the ambush in the garage below didn't send Dominic into a panic. It honed him, sharpened him into a weapon. His eyes, already an icy blue, seemed to drop another 10 degrees, becoming chips of glacial ice. He issued a string of calm, precise orders to Marco over an intercom system, his voice a low, lethal hum that betrayed no fear, only focus. He was a general on the eve of a battle he had long anticipated. He turned to Alina, his expression a mask of controlled fury, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, a raw fear not for himself, but for her. "You will stay here," he commanded. "Marco's men will secure this floor. You will not be in danger." But Alina shook her head, a new and unfamiliar resolve hardening her own features. She had spent days as a protected asset, a woman in a gilded cage. She had cowered in alleys and cried in his arms. She would not hide now. The woman who had meticulously untangled the Morty's criminal web was not the same woman who had stumbled into his life. She had found her own strength in the heart of his dangerous world. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "They are doing this because of me. They think I am your weakness. I will not hide upstairs while you fight a battle that I helped start. I am with you in this, Dominic, all the way." He stared at her for a long moment, a conflict warring in his eyes. He saw not the terrified woman from the alley, but a queen ready to stand by her king. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. It was a look of profound respect. "All right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you do exactly as I say." The plan was simple, brutal, and hinged on the element of surprise. They wouldn't go down the main elevator into the trap. There was a service elevator, a freight lift at the back of the building that led to a lower, less used section of the garage. Dominic, Alina, and 2 of his most trusted men, armed and silent, descended into the concrete heart of the tower. The air in the garage was cold and smelled of gasoline and damp concrete. It was an echoing, shadowy space, a concrete catacomb where violence was about to be born. They moved silently along the walls, using the massive support pillars for cover. Across the garage, they could see them, a half-dozen of Morty's men, trying to look casual as they loitered around a black van, their positions forming a kill box around the elevator bay Dominic was supposed to use. Dominic gave a hand signal. His men fanned out, disappearing into the shadows. He pulled Alina behind a large concrete pillar, his body a solid shield in front of hers. "When it starts," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear, "the fire alarms will go off. It will cause confusion. That's our window." His plan was to use the chaos to neutralize the threat and capture one of the men for information. But Alina's mind, the accountant's mind that saw patterns and weak points, saw something else. She saw the sprinkler system heads on the ceiling and the massive ventilation fan controls on the wall just a few feet away. "Dominic," she whispered urgently, her mind racing. "The sprinklers will ruin their visibility, but the fans, if you activate the emergency ventilation, the noise will be deafening. It will disorient them more than the alarms. They won't be able to hear each other to coordinate." He looked from the control panel to her, a flash of surprise and admiration in his eyes. It was a brilliant tactical addition. He gave a short, sharp nod. The first gunshot came from one of his men, a precise shot that took out a tire on the van, the sound cracking through the cavernous space. Immediately, the fire alarms blared, a piercing shriek accompanied by flashing strobe lights. As Morty's men scrambled, momentarily confused, Dominic moved. But before he could act, Alina darted from behind the pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs. She slammed her hand against the large red button for the emergency ventilation system. A deep, deafening roar filled the garage as massive fans whirred to life, creating a vortex of sound and air. The combination of the noise, the strobing lights, and the sudden downpour from the activated sprinklers created absolute chaos. She had given Dominic and his men the perfect cover. The fight was brutal and blessedly short. In the disorienting tempest she had created, Dominic's men moved with lethal efficiency. Dominic himself was a force of nature, a blur of controlled violence, disarming and neutralizing the threat with a terrifying grace. When the noise died down and the alarms were silenced, the Morty crew was subdued, and the last Morty patriarch, Antonio himself, who had foolishly been overseeing the operation from the back of the van, was dragged out and thrown to his knees at Dominic's feet. Antonio Morty, a man who had terrorized the city for decades, looked up at Dominic, his face a mask of hate and fear. "Finish it, Vale," he spat, blood trickling from his lip. "Do what your father never had the stomach to do." Dominic stood over him, a pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. The air was thick with the promise of long-awaited vengeance. He could end it right here, end the blood feud that had defined his entire life. He looked at the pathetic man kneeling before him, and then his eyes found Alina, standing pale but resolute a few feet away. He saw the strength in her, the courage, and the fundamental goodness he had sworn to protect. Killing this man in cold blood would not be justice. It would be a continuation of the same savage cycle. It would drag him deeper into the darkness, a darkness he no longer wanted to inhabit alone. For her, he had to be more than just his father's son. He had to be a better man. He lowered the gun. "No," Dominic said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "Death is too easy for you. I'm not going to make you a martyr. I'm going to make you a memory." He turned to Marco. "Call the district attorney. Give him everything. The ledgers, the offshore accounts, the witness we just acquired. We are going to burn his empire to the ground legally, piece by piece, until there is nothing left but ash." Dawn was breaking as they stood on the courthouse steps, a scene from the future they had fought for. The media was a frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted questions as the last of the Morty crime family were led away in handcuffs. Dominic Vale, the untouchable CEO, had won. He stood beside Alina, his hands securely on her back, not as a captor but as a partner. They didn't speak to the press. They simply watched their victory unfold, then turned and walked away, leaving the chaos behind them. Back in the penthouse, the early morning sun streamed through the windows, bathing the room in a soft, golden light. It was no longer a cage or a fortress, but a home. The city, their city, was spread out before them, quiet and peaceful. Dominic turned to her, taking both of her hands in his. The icy control was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, profound emotion that left him exposed, vulnerable. "It's over," he said softly. "What happens now?" she asked, her heart full. "Now," he said, his voice thick with a promise that was more sacred than any vow, "we build something new, together. I don't just want to offer you my protection, Alina. I want to offer you my life, my name, my future. I love you." Alina looked at the man before her, the mafia boss, the CEO, the protector, the wounded boy, the king of the city. She had run from danger and found herself in his arms, but in doing so, she had also found her own power, her own courage. She was not a woman who had been saved, but a woman who had chosen her own destiny. A radiant smile, the first truly unfettered smile she had worn in a lifetime, lit up her face. "I love you too, Dominic." He pulled her into his arms, and as he kissed her, the sun rose higher over the city, illuminating the skyline of the kingdom they would now rule together. The storm was over, and their reign had just begun.